Hi guys, it's Caroline, and today's video is going to be all about how you can crush your Goodreads challenge. Now, there's two things that I like to look at with my Goodreads challenge. One, I like to see if I can get a certain number of books, which I think is the most basic and the one that most people do when they talk about a Goodreads challenge. And for that, I'm going to be naming 5 short books that you'll just absolutely devour. But also I like to look at the average page count of each of my books for the year. And so I don't like it if I go down. I always like to stay right at or above, or at least in the same range. So if all of a sudden it's too low, I need to start reading some fat books to get that number up. So I'm also including 5 big books that are actually worth the length. So without further ado, let's get into those short books. The first one is 21 Truths About Love. Now, this is a book that's written entirely in lists, so it just flies by so fast. Like, you can read so many pages per minute because it's just all bullets or numbered lists or checklists or whatever. It's about this man who owns a bookstore. Bookstore's not doing so hot. He maybe didn't know what he was getting into, and he loves his wife, but his wife just got pregnant and he's maybe not ready for fatherhood. And also they're not financially that stable, but he doesn't want to tell her that because she's really excited about having a kid, and it's sort of him dealing with all of that. It's kind of fun, it's cute, it's heartwarming, and it's kind of something fun to read around the holidays just because it has that uplifting vibe at the end, and it's so fast. So that's a really good one. Next up is Anna and the Swallow Man. It's about a little girl who's wandering around Poland during World War II, and she's like lost her parents, and she meets this mysterious man called the Swallow Man who, for whatever reason, decides to protect her and kind of, for lack of a better term, take her under his wing. And it's just a really sweet and endearing story, despite the fact that it's super harsh and in such a terrible, like, setup, but it's heartbreaking, but it's also beautiful, and it's super quick, but it packs a punch and you won't want to put it down. I think I read it in one sitting. Next up is In the Dream House, which is a memoir by Carmen Maria Machado, who is known for her short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties. In the Dream House is a memoir. It's about her abusive relationship with a woman, and the memoir sort of goes into how these kind of abusive relationships aren't often talked about, nor when we talk about heterosexual abusive relationships, when we even do talk about abusive relationships. And the memoir is set up in different chunks, and it sort of talks about literary tropes, whether in the horror genre or in like abuse narrative or just tropes in general, and sort of configures that into her memoir. It's almost impossible to explain, but it is very well crafted, and it's super fast because it's written in almost little vignettes that's like happily ever after in the dream house, stuff like that. Impossible to explain, amazing to read. You need to check it out. Even if you don't consider yourself a nonfiction person, I think it's really worth it because it ties deeply into the literary tradition, but it's also very educational, and it's also her personal story, and she's a wonderful writer. Next up is Nothing to See Here, which is pretty short. I listened to it on audiobook, which I would recommend, and it's just about these 2 children who are the sons of a senator, and they just spontaneously combust, and this babysitter is asked to come take care of them and paid a bunch of money to kind of keep them away from the public eye so that they don't know these children like set on fire randomly. It's so weird, but it's very touching and heartwarming and very, very silly. And it's not super long because there's only so much you can say about children who just spontaneously combust, but I really liked it. It's about being a child, but also being left out, and who we love and who we deem worthy of love. I would highly recommend it. Finally, we have Andrew Sean Greer's Less, which I absolutely adore. I've read it twice. It won the Pulitzer in 2018. It's so funny. It's about this man. He's a writer, but not a very famous one, and he gets this thing in the mail from his ex-lover who is now getting married, and he doesn't want to go to the wedding, but he doesn't want to say, oh, I'm not going to the wedding, because that looks petty. So he purposely puts together like a book tour / world traveling thing, so he can say he's out of town, and he can't afford to travel on his own, so he has to set it up like a book tour. So he goes all around the world to avoid the wedding of his ex-boyfriend, and it's just all his funny escapades, but also like there's all sorts of random like publishing jokes, but also world jokes. There's just all sorts of crazy funny stuff that goes on, and it is a riot, and you'll just blow right through it because it's so funny. You'll forget you're even reading, and I love that book with my whole heart, and I wish more people would read it. Okay, now we're gonna get into the long books that are worth it. So first up is Middlemarch by George Eliot. I don't have to give this book a big introduction, but honestly, there's a reason why this is famously known as one of the best books of all time. It's totally worth the hype. It's a lot of pages. It's like 800 pages, and the text ain't that big. And while almost nothing happens, everything happens. It's so skillfully crafted, and it captured my attention all the way through. It's honestly one of my favorite classics, and even if you're someone who is really nervous about dipping your toe into classics, as someone who also read Moby Dick this year, I can say with my whole chest, read Middlemarch instead. Next up, I have Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. I swear I'm not a Cassie Clare fanatic, even though I keep mentioning this book, but the reason I think it's perfect for this is because this is a long book. My copy is almost 600 pages, but Cassie Clare's books are notoriously huge printed. Like, the print is huge. I think I can read 45 pages in half an hour, when usually with a book I read anywhere between 28 and 32 pages in half an hour. So you just blow through this book, and they're engaging, they're silly, they're funny, they're action-packed, so you get lost in the world, but then also the font is huge, the margins are huge. It's like Harry Potter. You read it so friggin' fast. So that's the way to go if you're trying to up your page count. I don't know what else to tell you. Next up, I would suggest The Brief History of 7 Killings, which is not brief at all. I think it's around 600 or 700 pages. It's by Marlon James. It won the Booker, and it kind of details Bob Marley and Bob Marley's death, but not really. It's also about the American presence in Jamaica during that the time of Bob Marley, and just sort of America meddling in countries when it shouldn't. It's also about masculinity and queerness in Jamaica. It's about a lot of things. It's very violent, it's very dark, but there's so many perspectives that you're going through and cycling through our perspectives, but you're constantly getting new information, you're constantly figuring new stuff out. There's a huge plot to unravel, so it's engaging, and it's a little hard to look at, but it's also because it's so violent, you almost think, I gotta get through this, because you're I can't take the violence anymore. But I mean that in a good way, not this book is terrible, but the book's really engaging. The next thing I will recommend is The Final Empire, which is the first in the Mistborn series. Now, I am a new Brandon Sanderson fan, but I have had this box set. It'd been sitting on my shelf for forever, and in quarantine I said, let's do it, and boy, was I not disappointed. The plot is so engaging, and it's so fast-paced, and you fall in love with all the characters that you can't help but keep reading. And even as the series continues, you learn a lot more about the world. The world building really escalates. You learn more about the magic system, so you're constantly intrigued because you want to know, how does this end? How does this end? What does this mean? Why are these characters doing this? How is this possible? And so you're just gripped from the start. And honestly, I blew through these because I just could not think about doing anything else besides reading. And I think that's what you want in a long book. And finally, I'm going to recommend Cloud Atlas. And Cloud Atlas is another biggish book, and it's got kind of tiny font, but the way it's divided is there's 5 stories, and it's almost like a Russian nesting doll. So the first story is what starts and ends the book, and then there's a story within a story that is like this, like this, like this, and then there's one story in the middle. And because it's broken up then into 9 sections, and each section is kind of its own story, it reads like a collection of short stories. I mean, you just have to read 40 pages of each thing or whatever, and it gives you a huge glimpse into what's happening. And the middle section is almost like its own novella, but you're interested in each piece because you want to understand how they weave together and how it's important and why they're nested. So it's engaging, but it's also cut up into bite-sized pieces. That's perfect for someone who is trying to just get through a bigger book, because you can read one piece and put it down for a little while and read the next piece, because the pieces don't you don't have to go sleuthing for all the connections, because they're not supposed to be deeply intertwined. They're just supposed to be kind of conceptually intertwined with a few Easter eggs. And I think it's brilliant. It's very well done, and it's a very smart book. But even if you're not looking for all the different takes on colonialism or whatever that the book is actually making, it's just, in and of itself, it's 5 very different stories. And there's something in it for everyone, because he hits different genres in each nugget. And I really admire that and I respect it. Those are my 5 short books and 5 long books that I think will help you crush your Goodreads goal and get those end of the year stats looking how you want them to look. And hope you enjoy.